In this series of videos, I'd like to introduce to you the ideas of clustering and document similarity in order to talk about recommender systems, which will be our next major unit. And I want to start by doing that with a super interesting story that happened somewhat recently, and it's the story of Anjit Pai. More specifically, it's the story of the FCC, who in 2017 was considering eliminating net neutrality, which is somewhat open access to the internet. So this was a big story a couple of years ago. And as you should, whenever you're making very large decisions about very important issues, the FCC wanted to do its due diligence and have a comment period as a litmus test for how people were feeling about net neutrality. Should they keep it? Should they repeal it? And this was unnaturally popular. Over 22 million comments were received by the FCC during this period. And so as they deliberated about what they ought to do regarding net neutrality, they had 22 million comments to weed through and use as feedback. Now, in many ways, that might sound like a good thing. They had a lot of people who were passionate about this issue. That would give them a good idea of how the public was feeling. And so if you just look at those 22 million comments on the surface, the majority of them were anti-net neutrality. So they really wanted net neutrality repealed as it stood in 2017. However, if you examine the data at all, any more deeply, some very disturbing things started to become immediately apparent. So for example, up to 9.5 million people had their identities stolen in order to register fake comments. There's a very chilling article where a woman talks about reading a comment submitted by her mother that she felt was not submitted by her mother because it seemed fundamentally against who her mother was as a person, but also that her mother had been dead for many years and could not have possibly submitted this comment for the FCC. Something else that happened in the data was that there were 7 comments that appeared over and over and over again in those 22 million. And so the 7 most popular comments were each repeated at least 1 million times. That doesn't quite seem like a letter writing campaign. Not to mention that when you submit a comment to the FCC website, there's a unique timestamp that's put on it that records the time of submission down to the millisecond. And we would find something like hundreds of thousands of submissions that were happening at precisely the same millisecond. And that sort of screams that there's a bot behind this, because that's just so incredibly unlikely to happen as a natural occurrence. And so there were some real concerns about this data that the FCC had with the 22 million comments stating that the will of the American people was to repeal net neutrality. And in fact, if you restrict the data in almost any reasonable way, for example, getting rid of the 9.5 million comments that were submitted fraudulently, or taking just those 7 comments that appeared the most frequently and counting them 1 time each instead of a couple million times each, do anything reasonable of that nature, the exact opposite conclusion was coming through from this data, that in fact, the majority of things that were submitted by real people were saying, no, do not repeal net neutrality. So that became a big issue. How do we take these 22 million comments that were very obviously tampered with, and how do we get at the core of the ones that were truly unique? So that was in fact the most common restriction when people would look at and evaluate this data. They said, let's restrict to unique comments. Of all the comments that we have, let's just take them, and if they appear more than once, let's just count them once. And to just show you the extent of how much this was tampered with, that leaves us with only 3 million comments, roughly. So there was a huge amount of replication going on in this data set. But even that is not a very imposing restriction. So I have 2 examples of comments that would survive this process and be considered unique comments. If you take a look at these 2 comments that we have written down here, in fact, they're exactly the same comment, except first comment adds 4 little words at the front, don't kill net neutrality, and then they are word for word the same. Similarly, here are some longer comments. You don't necessarily need to read each of them because I've highlighted the things of importance. When I talk about unique comments, and I give that 3 million number, that also includes the order of the words. And so if you just took the exact same comment and rearranged the sentences in a different order, this common restriction would say, oh, those are unique reviews. Those are different. They now have words appearing in different orders. Those are not the same. But we all know that this was a copy and paste job of exactly the same comment, and maybe we don't necessarily want to be counting that twice. So I've highlighted the sentences for you to show how they've been rearranged. And then something much more interesting happens. There were examples of comments that were very distinctly different on a word-for-word basis. They weren't just a simple hack of I took the same sentences and I rearranged the order, or I added a word here or there. But when you look at them, it starts to become clear that they are very, very similar indeed. And so there's this great example from Hacker Noon, who did a fantastic data analysis job of this particular problem, where he looked at some comments that were identified as unique in this restriction, but he said, those are not unique comments. They're like a Mad Libs. They were definitely created by some sort of bot that had the ability to choose synonyms. So in these sentences that he's highlighted, there's citizens and there's people like me, rather than, as opposed to, the FCC, so-called experts. And you can see that if you go through both reviews side by side, that the reviews are approximately the same length, they have a lot of the same words, but it's more like a Mad Libs where synonyms were chosen all the way down the road in order to mask these comments as different. And that is a much more concerning problem that we could really employ some data science techniques to identify comments like that. So that's what we're going to be heading towards in this unit, is understanding how could we use techniques of data science to identify comments such as these as being a high likelihood that they were written by a bot instead of a person.